The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Captain Elena Vasquez walked through the courtyard, her boots clicking against the concrete with practiced precision. She had been stationed at Fort Morrison for 3 years, and every day began the same way. Morning inspection, followed by training exercises, followed by the endless paperwork that seemed to multiply like weeds in her office. Elena was not like the other officers on the base. While most had come from military families or prestigious academies, she had clawed her way up from the enlisted ranks through sheer determination and an unwavering sense of justice. Her father had been a factory worker, her mother a nurse, and they had taught her that respect was earned, not demanded. The base buzzed with unusual activity that morning. Word had spread quickly through the ranks that General Marcus Sterling was arriving for an unexpected inspection. Sterling was a legend in military circles, a decorated war hero who had served in 3 different conflicts, and was known for his iron discipline and uncompromising standards. He was also known for something else that made Elena's stomach turn: his treatment of female officers. Stories about Sterling had circulated for years, whispered in mess halls, and shared in private conversations. Women under his command had reported inappropriate behavior, unwanted advances, and a culture of intimidation that made their service lives miserable. But Sterling was untouchable. His war record was impeccable. His connections reached the highest levels of the Pentagon, and complaints against him seemed to disappear into bureaucratic black holes. Elena had heard these stories, had seen the fear in the eyes of female colleagues who had served under Sterling at other bases. She had also heard about Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a brilliant young officer who had filed a formal complaint against Sterling 2 years ago. Chin's career had been systematically destroyed afterward. Poor performance reviews appeared out of nowhere. Choice assignments went to less qualified candidates. And, eventually, she had been forced to resign from the military entirely. As Elena prepared for the general's arrival, she thought about her own principles. Her parents had raised her to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. They had taught her that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with courage and moral conviction. The call came at 0900 hours sharp. All officers were to assemble in the main courtyard for General Sterling's inspection. Elena adjusted her uniform, checked her appearance one final time, and walked out to join her colleagues. The courtyard filled quickly with officers standing at attention in perfect formation. Elena took her place in the second row, her heart beating steadily as she waited. She had made a decision during the night, one that could end her career but would allow her to sleep with a clear conscience. General Sterling arrived precisely on time, stepping out of a black staff car with the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. He was tall and imposing, with silver hair and steely gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. His uniform was immaculate, his chest decorated with an impressive array of ribbons and medals that told the story of a distinguished military career. The base commander, Colonel Harrison, stepped forward to greet Sterling. "General, welcome to Fort Morrison. The troops are assembled for your inspection, sir." Sterling nodded curtly and began his walk down the line of officers. Each one snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute as he passed. Sterling's eyes lingered on the female officers, and Elena could see the discomfort in their postures, the way they held themselves rigidly as if trying to disappear. When Sterling reached Lieutenant Jessica Martinez, a promising young engineer, Elena watched as his gaze traveled up and down her uniform in a way that had nothing to do with military inspection. Martinez's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure and saluted. Sterling smiled, not the professional acknowledgement of a superior officer, but something that made Elena's blood run cold. The general continued down the line, and Elena could feel her moment approaching. Her palms were damp with perspiration, but her resolve was unwavering. She thought about Sarah Chun, about Jessica Martinez, about all the women who had suffered in silence because speaking up seemed futile. Sterling stopped in front of her, his gray eyes meeting hers with the expectation of automatic deference. The courtyard fell silent except for the distant sound of flags snapping in the breeze. "Captain," Sterling said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. Elena looked directly into his eyes and remained perfectly still. She did not move her hand to her forehead. She did not acknowledge his rank. She simply stood there, her spine straight and her gaze unwavering. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable and then electric with tension. Other officers began to glance sideways, sensing that something was wrong. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, confusion written across his face. Captain Vasquez, Harrison said sharply, render proper honors to General Sterling. Elena's voice was calm and clear when she spoke. I cannot render honors to someone who dishonors the uniform, sir. The courtyard erupted in shocked murmurs. Several officers gasped audibly. General Sterling's face flushed red, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. What did you say, Captain? Sterling's voice was dangerously quiet. Elena had crossed the point of no return, and she knew it. Her career was over, but she pressed on. I said I cannot salute someone who uses his rank to intimidate and abuse female soldiers, General. Someone who has turned military service into a nightmare for countless women who deserved better. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could feel the eyes of every person in the courtyard burning into her, could sense the shock and fear radiating from her fellow officers. She had done something unthinkable, publicly challenged a general officer, questioned his integrity, refused a direct order. Sterling stepped closer to her, his face now purple with rage. You are way out of line, Captain. I could have you court-martialed for insubordination. I could destroy your career with a phone call. Elena met his gaze without flinching. My career was never worth preserving if it meant staying silent about what you've done. About what you did to Sarah Chun. The name hit Sterling like a physical blow. His confident expression faltered for just a moment, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. The mention of Sarah Chen's name in front of witnesses, in such a public setting, had consequences he had not anticipated. Elena saw the change in his demeanor and knew she had struck home. She also knew that she had just painted a target on her back that would never be removed. But, as she stood there in that courtyard, facing down one of the most powerful men in the military, she felt something she had never experienced before. The pure, clean feeling of knowing she had done the right thing, regardless of the cost. Colonel Harrison was frantically trying to regain control of the situation. General Sterling, perhaps we should continue this discussion in private. Captain Vasquez, report to my office immediately after this formation. But Sterling was not finished. He leaned closer to Elena, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Captain. I've destroyed better officers than you for much less. Elena's response was equally quiet but carried the weight of absolute conviction. And I know exactly who I'm dealing with, General. The question is, do you know who you're dealing with now? Something in her tone, in the confidence with which she spoke, gave Sterling pause. Elena was not backing down, was not showing the fear he was accustomed to seeing in junior officers. There was something else in her eyes, something that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. The standoff continued for several more seconds before Sterling finally stepped back. He was clearly struggling to maintain his composure in front of the assembled officers, aware that every eye was watching his reaction to this unprecedented challenge to his authority. We'll finish this conversation later, Captain, Sterling said, his voice carrying the promise of retribution. Elena nodded once, still refusing to salute. I look forward to it, General. As Sterling moved on to complete his inspection, Elena remained at attention, her mind racing. She had taken the first step down a path that would change everything, not just for her, but potentially for every woman who had suffered under Sterling's command. She had no idea what would come next, but she was prepared for whatever consequences awaited. The inspection continued, but the atmosphere in the courtyard had changed completely. Officers whispered among themselves when they thought no one was looking. Some viewed Elena as a hero, others as a fool who had just committed career suicide. But everyone understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when principle had triumphed over self-preservation. As the formation finally dispersed, Elena made her way toward Colonel Harrison's office, knowing that her real battle was just beginning. Behind her, she could hear Sterling speaking in low, angry tones with his staff, already beginning to plan his response to this public humiliation. Elena thought about her parents, about the values they had instilled in her, about the oath she had taken when she became an officer. She had sworn to support and defend the Constitution, to bear true faith and allegiance to the principles of justice and honor. Today, she had honored that oath in the truest sense possible. The corridors of the administration building seemed longer than usual as she walked toward what could be the end of her military career. But, with each step, her resolve only strengthened. She had taken a stand, and now she would face whatever came next with the same courage that had driven her to refuse that salute. In the distance, she could hear the sound of helicopters approaching, probably bringing more senior officers to deal with what would undoubtedly become a major incident. Elena straightened her shoulders and continued walking. She had started something that could not be stopped, and she was ready to see it through to the end. Colonel Harrison's office felt smaller than usual as Elena sat in the chair facing his desk, waiting for what she knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of her military career. Through the window, she could see maintenance crews working on vehicles in the motor pool, their routine tasks a stark contrast to the chaos her actions had unleashed. Harrison was pacing behind his desk, his normally composed demeanor cracked by the unprecedented situation. He had been the base commander for 5 years and had never faced anything like this. A junior officer publicly refusing to salute a general, making serious allegations in front of dozens of witnesses. "Captain Vasquez," Harrison began, his voice tight with stress. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand the magnitude of the accusations you've made?" Elena kept her posture erect, her hands folded in her lap. "I understand completely, sir. I also understand that sometimes doing the right thing requires taking risks." Harrison stopped pacing and fixed her with a hard stare. "The right thing? You've just accused one of the most decorated generals in the army of serious misconduct. Without proof. In front of dozens of witnesses. General Sterling is demanding your immediate court-martial for insubordination. Then, let him demand it, sir. I'm prepared to face the consequences." The colonel sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly, looking older than his 52 years. "Elena, and I'm speaking to you off the record now. I've known you for 3 years. You're one of the finest officers I've ever had the privilege to command. Your record is spotless, your integrity unquestioned. That's the only reason I'm not placing you under arrest right now." Elena felt a flicker of gratitude toward Harrison, but she kept her expression neutral. "I appreciate that, sir. But I need to know, do you have evidence to support these allegations? Because if you don't, your career is over. And not just over. You could face criminal charges for making false statements about a superior officer." Before Elena could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door. Harrison's aide entered without waiting for permission, his face pale with urgency. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a Major Patricia Wells from the Inspector General's office here to see you. She says it's urgent and concerns the incident in the courtyard." Harrison's eyebrows shot up in surprise. The Inspector General's office was the Army's internal investigation arm, responsible for looking into serious allegations of misconduct. Their involvement meant that Elena's public challenge to Sterling had already reached the highest levels of the military hierarchy. "Send her in," Harrison said, then turned to Elena. "Captain, I'm going to ask you to remain here for this conversation." Major Wells entered the office with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with complex investigations. She was a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that commanded immediate respect. Elena recognized the type, an officer who had navigated the challenges of military service through competence and careful attention to detail. "Colonel Harrison, Captain Vasquez," Wells said, nodding to each of them in turn. "I'm here because we've received multiple reports about an incident that occurred during this morning's inspection. Captain Vasquez, I understand you refused to salute General Sterling and made serious allegations about his conduct?" Elena straightened in her chair. "That's correct, Major." Wells opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a digital recorder. "I'm going to need to take your statement, Captain. But first, I want you to understand something. The allegations you've made are extremely serious. If you proceed with this, there will be a full investigation. Your life, your background, your service record, everything will be examined under a microscope. Are you prepared for that?" "I am, Major." Wells activated the recorder and placed it on Harrison's desk. "This is Major Patricia Wells, Inspector General's office, conducting an initial interview regarding allegations made against General Marcus Sterling. Present are Colonel James Harrison, base commander, and Captain Elena Vasquez, the complainant. Captain Vasquez, please state in your own words what occurred during this morning's inspection." Elena took a deep breath and began her account, starting with her decision to refuse the salute and continuing through the tense confrontation in the courtyard. Wells listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small pad. When Elena finished, Wells was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she asked, "Captain, you mentioned Lieutenant Sarah Chun specifically. What do you know about her situation?" Elena hesitated, knowing that her next words would cross another line. "I know that Lieutenant Chun filed a formal complaint against General Sterling 2 years ago alleging sexual harassment and inappropriate conduct. I know that her complaint was buried and that she was subsequently forced out of the service through a pattern of retaliation." Wells and Harrison exchanged glances. This was new information, and both officers understood its significance. "How do you know this, Captain?" Wells asked. "Because Sarah Chun is my cousin, Major. She told me everything that happened." The silence in the room was deafening. Elena had just revealed a personal connection that added an entirely new dimension to the situation. It explained her knowledge of details that should have been confidential, and it provided context for her willingness to risk her career. Harrison leaned forward in his chair. "Captain, why didn't you ever mention this connection before?" "Because Sarah made me promise not to, sir. She was afraid that any family members in the service would face retaliation. She was trying to protect me." Wells made more notes, her expression thoughtful. "Captain, is your cousin willing to speak with investigators? Would she be willing to provide testimony about what allegedly occurred?" Elena felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. "I believe so, Major. Sarah has been carrying this burden for 2 years. I think she would welcome the chance to finally tell her story to people who might actually listen." The Major closed her portfolio and picked up the recorder. "Captain Vasquez, I'm going to be completely honest with you. What you've done today has set in motion a chain of events that will be very difficult to control. General Sterling is a powerful man with many allies. The investigation into these allegations will be thorough, but it will also be fought every step of the way by people who have a vested interest in protecting him." Elena nodded. "I understand, Major." "I'm not sure you do," Wells continued. "This isn't just about you anymore. If we proceed with a full investigation, every aspect of General Sterling's career will be examined. That means other victims may come forward. It means that decades of alleged misconduct could be exposed. The ripple effects will be enormous." Harrison had been listening to this exchange with growing concern. "Major Wells, what's the procedure from here? What happens to Captain Vasquez?" Wells turned to address both officers. "For now, Captain Vasquez remains on active duty, but she'll be reassigned to administrative duties pending the completion of our investigation. She'll be required to make herself available for additional interviews as needed. Colonel Harrison, I'll need complete copies of all personnel files related to this incident, and I'll need to interview every officer who witnessed the confrontation in the courtyard." The Major paused, studying Elena carefully. "Captain, there's something else you need to know. Within an hour of this morning's incident, General Sterling contacted the Pentagon. He's claiming that your refusal to salute was part of a planned attack on his reputation, possibly coordinated with outside elements hostile to the military. He's suggesting that you may have been influenced by anti-military activists or foreign agents." Elena felt her blood run cold. This was a tactic she hadn't anticipated. Sterling was trying to frame her actions as something more sinister than a simple protest against misconduct. If he could make those charges stick, she wouldn't just face a court-martial for insubordination. She could be charged with treason. "That's completely false, Major. My actions were my own, based on my personal knowledge of General Sterling's behavior and my oath to uphold the principles of military service." Wells nodded. "I believe you, Captain. But you need to understand that this investigation is now operating at the highest levels of the Pentagon. Political considerations are at play. General Sterling has friends in Congress, allies in the defense establishment. They'll use every tool at their disposal to discredit you and bury these allegations." Harrison stood up and walked to the window, his shoulders tense. "Major, what can we do to protect Captain Vasquez? She may have acted outside normal channels, but I believe her motivations were honorable." "The best protection Captain Vasquez has is the truth," Wells replied. "If her cousin is willing to testify, if other victims come forward, if we can build a solid case based on evidence rather than accusations, then she has a chance. But it's going to be a long, difficult process." Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had started something that was now much bigger than her personal protest. Other people's lives and careers would be affected by what happened next. "Major Wells," Elena said quietly, "I want you to know that I don't regret what I did this morning. If the only thing that comes from this is that General Sterling can never again abuse his position to harm female soldiers, then it was worth it." Wells smiled for the first time since entering the office. "Captain, I've been investigating misconduct cases for 8 years, and I've met many complainants. Most of them are angry or frightened or looking for some kind of personal gain. You're different. You genuinely care about doing the right thing, even if it costs you everything." The Major gathered her materials and prepared to leave. "I'll be in touch within the next 24 hours. Captain Vasquez, I strongly recommend that you contact a military attorney. You're going to need legal representation before this is over." As Wells left the office, Elena and Harrison sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, the colonel spoke. "Elena, off the record, Do you really think you can win this fight? Sterling has survived other challenges to his reputation. He's very good at protecting himself. Elena considered the question carefully. Sir, I don't know if I can win. But I know that if I don't try, then Sarah Chen's suffering was meaningless. And if I don't try, then the next woman who serves under General Sterling might face the same treatment, and the one after that, and the one after that. Harrison nodded slowly. I understand. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. I should have done something years ago when I first heard the rumors about Sterling. Maybe if more of us had shown your courage, those women wouldn't have had to suffer alone. Elena stood to leave, then turned back to Harrison. Sir, there's something else you should know. When I mentioned Sarah Chen's name to General Sterling this morning, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. That tells me he knows exactly what he's done, and he knows that the truth could destroy him. People who are innocent don't react that way. As Elena left Harrison's office and walked back through the base, she noticed that other officers were looking at her differently. Some with respect, others with suspicion, many with simple curiosity about the woman who had dared to challenge a general. Word of her actions was spreading quickly through the military grapevine, and she knew that by evening, her story would be known at bases around the world. She thought about Sarah Chen, probably going about her civilian job with no idea that her long-buried complaint was about to be resurrected. Elena would need to call her cousin soon, to warn her about what was coming and to ask for her help in seeking justice. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Elena reached her quarters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures, new attempts to discredit her and silence her voice. But tonight, she would allow herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had kept her promise to herself and to her principles. She had spoken truth to power, regardless of the consequences. The battle for justice was just beginning, but Elena was ready to fight it with everything she had. 3 days after the courtyard confrontation, Elena's world had changed completely. Her phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, military attorneys, and fellow officers expressing everything from support to outrage. She had been reassigned to a windowless office in the base's administrative building, where her new duties consisted mainly of reviewing supply requisitions and updating training records. Busy work designed to keep her out of sight while the investigation unfolded. The call she had been dreading finally came on Thursday afternoon. Sarah Chen's voice was tight with anxiety when Elena answered her personal cell phone. Elena, what have you done? I just had 2 investigators from the Army show up at my workplace. They want me to testify about Sterling. Elena closed her office door and lowered her voice. Sarah, I'm sorry. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Not after seeing him inspect female officers the same way he treated you. You promised me you wouldn't get involved. You promised you wouldn't let my situation affect your career. My career stopped matching the moment I watched General Sterling intimidate Lieutenant Martinez. Sarah, this is our chance. Maybe our only chance to stop him. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was softer but still filled with apprehension. Elena, you don't understand what he's capable of. After I filed my complaint, my life became a nightmare. They found ways to make everything difficult. My security clearance was delayed, my performance reviews were suddenly terrible, choice assignments went to less qualified officers. They made it clear that I would never advance, never succeed, as long as I stayed in the Army. But that was 2 years ago, and you were alone. This time is different. Major Wells from the IG's office seems genuinely committed to getting to the truth, and there may be other victims willing to come forward. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then sighed heavily. The investigators want me to come to Washington next week for a formal interview. They say they have evidence that my complaint was deliberately suppressed and that there may have been a pattern of retaliation. Elena felt a surge of hope. Will you do it? I don't know. I've built a new life as a civilian. I have a good job, a relationship that's important to me. If I testify against Sterling, all of that could be destroyed again. He has connections everywhere. Elena, the military isn't the only place where he has influence. Before Elena could respond, there was a sharp knock on her office door. She told Sarah to hold on and opened the door to find Lieutenant Colonel David Kim, the base's staff judge advocate, the senior military lawyer responsible for legal affairs. Captain Vasquez, I need to speak with you immediately. It's urgent. Elena told Sarah she would call her back and hung up the phone. Kim entered her office and closed the door behind him, his expression grim. Captain, I've just received word from the Pentagon. General Sterling has formally requested that you be charged with conduct unbecoming an officer, insubordination, and violation of Article 88 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, contempt toward officials. Elena felt her stomach drop. Article 88 was serious. It prohibited officers from using contemptuous words against the president, Congress, or other senior officials. If convicted, she could face dismissal from service and possibly prison time. Colonel Kim, I was exercising my duty to report misconduct by a superior officer. The manual for courts-martial specifically protects soldiers who report violations of law or regulation. Kim sat down across from her desk, his expression troubled. Captain, I've been practicing military law for 15 years, and I've never seen a case quite like this. Technically, you're correct about the whistleblower protections, but you didn't follow proper channels. You made your accusations in a public setting, in front of dozens of witnesses. That changes the legal landscape significantly. Elena leaned back in her chair, trying to process this new information. What's your assessment, sir? Do I have any chance of defending against these charges? That depends on several factors. First, can you prove that your allegations against General Sterling are true? If you can't substantiate your claims, then your refusal to salute looks like insubordination based on personal animosity rather than legitimate whistleblowing. And second, Kim hesitated before answering. Second, you need to understand the political realities here. General Sterling has friends in very high places. The Secretary of Defense was his classmate at West Point. He has allies in Congress who sit on the Defense Appropriations Committee. Even if your allegations are true, there are powerful people who have a vested interest in making this go away quietly. Elena thought about her conversation with Sarah Chun, about the fear in her cousin's voice and the difficult choice she was being asked to make. Colonel, what would you do in my position? Kim was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. Off the record, I think you're either the bravest officer I've ever met, or the most foolish. Maybe both. But I also think you've stumbled onto something that's been festering in our military for years, a culture that protects predators and punishes victims. He paused, then continued. Captain, I'm going to tell you something that could end my career if it ever became public. 3 years ago, I was contacted by a female major who wanted to file a complaint against General Sterling. She had served under him at Fort Bragg and alleged that he had made unwanted advances and created a hostile work environment. Elena felt her pulse quicken. What happened to her complaint? It never got filed. The major received a call from someone in Sterling's office. She never told me exactly what was said, but she withdrew her request for legal assistance the next day. 2 weeks later, she submitted her resignation from the Army. Elena stared at Kim in disbelief. You're telling me that General Sterling has been doing this for years, and no one has been able to stop him? I'm telling you that the system has failed repeatedly to hold him accountable. But your situation is different, Captain. You've made your accusations public. The Inspector General's office is involved. There's media attention. Sterling can't make this disappear as easily as he has in the past. Kim stood up to leave, then turned back to Elena. Captain, I'm going to recommend that you accept military counsel for your defense. But I'm also going to recommend someone specific, Major Janet Rodriguez. She specializes in defending officers accused of misconduct, and she has experience dealing with politically sensitive cases. After Kim left, Elena sat alone in her office, feeling the weight of her situation pressing down on her. She was facing court-martial charges that could end her career and possibly result in prison time. Her cousin was being pressured to relive the worst period of her life. Other women were being asked to come forward and expose themselves to potential retaliation. Her phone rang again. This time, it was Lieutenant Jessica Martinez, the young engineer who had been subjected to Sterling's inappropriate stare during the inspection. Captain Vasquez, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the base directory. I wanted to talk to you about what happened the other day. Of course, Lieutenant. What's on your mind? Martinez's voice was hesitant, but determined. I've been thinking about the way General Sterling looked at me during the inspection. It made me extremely uncomfortable, and it wasn't the first time something like that has happened with senior officers. I want you to know that I support what you did. Elena felt a flutter of hope. Lieutenant, have you been contacted by the Inspector General's office? Not yet, but I expect I will be soon. Captain, I want you to know that I'm prepared to testify about what I observed. Not just during the inspection, but about other incidents I've witnessed or heard about. Other incidents. Captain, there are stories. Lots of them. Female officers talk to each other. We share information about which commanders to avoid, which assignments to turn down, which social functions are unsafe to attend alone. General Sterling's name comes up frequently in those conversations. Elena felt her heart racing. If Martinez was right, if there were other women willing to speak out, then she might not be fighting this battle alone after all. Lieutenant, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Are you prepared for what's going to happen if you testify? They're going to attack your credibility, question your motives, examine every aspect of your personal and professional life. Are you ready for that level of scrutiny? Martinez was quiet for a moment, then responded with a firmness that surprised Elena. Captain, I joined the army to serve my country and to be part of something bigger than myself. I didn't join to be objectified or intimidated by men who think their rank gives them the right to treat women as property. If my testimony can help stop that, then, yes, I'm ready. After ending the call with Martinez, Elena walked to the window of her office and looked out at the base. Soldiers were going about their daily routines, conducting training exercises, maintaining equipment, preparing for deployments. Most of them had no idea that their institution was being challenged at its core by a simple refusal to salute. She thought about the oath she had taken when she was commissioned as an officer to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. At the time, she had assumed that enemies would be easy to identify, that they would come from outside the military. She had never imagined that some of the most dangerous enemies of military honor and integrity would wear the same uniform she did. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Captain Vasquez, this is Major Patricia Wells. I need to meet with you tomorrow morning at 0800. We have new developments in the investigation that you need to know about. Location, Building 447, Conference Room B. Elena saved the message and gathered her materials to leave for the day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, new tests of her resolve. But tonight, she would call Sarah Chun back and try to convince her cousin that justice was finally within reach. As she walked across the base toward her quarters, Elena noticed that other officers were watching her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Word of her confrontation with Sterling had spread throughout the military community, and she was becoming a symbol of resistance against an entrenched system of abuse and cover-ups. The evening air was cool and clear as Elena reached her building. She looked up at the stars and thought about her parents, about the values they had taught her, about the promise she had made to herself to always stand up for what was right. She was facing the greatest challenge of her life, but she was no longer facing it alone. The battle for justice was intensifying, but Elena was ready for whatever came next. Elena arrived at Building 447 15 minutes early, her stomach tight with anticipation. The conference room was sterile and windowless, furnished only with a long table and several chairs. Major Wells was already there, along with a man Elena didn't recognize, a thin, serious-looking civilian in his 40s wearing a navy blue suit. Captain Vasquez, Wells said as Elena entered. Thank you for coming. I'd like you to meet Mr. David Chun from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. He's a senior investigator who specializes in cases involving high-ranking officials. Elena shook Chun's hand, noting his firm grip and direct gaze. Something about his demeanor suggested that he was accustomed to dealing with complex, sensitive investigations. Captain, Chun said as they all took seats around the table, Major Wells has briefed me on your situation. I want you to know that we're taking your allegations very seriously. In fact, what you started with your refusal to salute General Sterling has opened up avenues of investigation that we've been trying to pursue for quite some time. Elena felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. What do you mean, sir? Wells opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across the table. Captain, what I'm about to show you is classified information that you're being read into because of your role as a complainant. 3 months ago, our office received an anonymous letter containing detailed allegations against General Sterling. The letter included specific dates, locations, and names of alleged victims. Elena leaned forward to examine the documents. The anonymous letter was typed and ran several pages, outlining a pattern of sexual harassment and abuse of power spanning more than a decade. It described incidents at multiple bases, involving dozens of female soldiers and officers. The letter was unsigned, Chun continued, which made it difficult to investigate. We had leads, but no complainant willing to come forward on the record. Your public confrontation with Sterling changed that dynamic completely. Wells pointed to one of the documents. Within 48 hours of your incident in the courtyard, we received calls from 7 different women, current and former military personnel, who said they were ready to testify about their experiences with General Sterling. Elena felt her heart racing. 7 women? Actually, it's now 12, Chen said. The number keeps growing as word spreads through the military community. It appears that your willingness to take a public stand has given others the courage to speak out. Elena thought about Lieutenant Martinez, about Sarah Chun, about all the women who had suffered in silence. What kind of experiences are they reporting? Wells exchanged glances with Chun before answering. The allegations range from inappropriate comments and sexual harassment to abuse of power and retaliation against those who complained. Some of the stories are quite disturbing, Captain. Chun pulled out another document. Captain, I need to ask you about your cousin, Sarah Chun. We interviewed her yesterday in Washington, and her testimony was extremely compelling. She provided specific details about incidents that occurred during her service, and she also gave us something we didn't expect. What was that? She kept a detailed diary during the time she served under General Sterling. Every incident, every conversation, every instance of retaliation, it's all documented with dates, times, and witnesses. Her diary corroborates information we've received from other complainants and fills in gaps in our timeline. Elena felt a wave of pride for her cousin's foresight and courage. Is Sarah willing to testify publicly? She is, Wells replied. In fact, she's already provided a sworn statement and agreed to testify at any court-martial proceedings. But, Captain, there's something else you need to know about Sarah's testimony. Elena waited, sensing that something significant was coming. Chen opened another folder and withdrew a photograph. Does this man look familiar to you? Elena studied the image. It showed a man in his 30s with dark hair and a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. She shook her head. I don't recognize him. His name is Kevin Walsh, Chen continued. He was a staff sergeant who served as General Sterling's administrative assistant for 2 years. According to Sarah Chen's diary, Walsh was present during several incidents where Sterling made inappropriate advances toward female soldiers. Wells leaned forward in her chair. Captain, Walsh contacted our office yesterday. He wants to provide testimony about what he witnessed during his time working for General Sterling. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. A male witness. Not just any male witness, Chen said. Walsh was Sterling's gatekeeper. He scheduled meetings, managed the general's calendar, screened phone calls. He saw everything that happened in Sterling's office. And, according to his preliminary statement, he documented much of what he witnessed. Why is he coming forward now? Wells smiled grimly. Apparently, Walsh has been carrying a burden of guilt for years about his failure to report what he saw. Your public confrontation with Sterling convinced him that it was finally time to do the right thing. Chen pulled out a tape recorder and placed it on the table. Captain, I want you to hear a portion of Walsh's preliminary interview. This was recorded yesterday with his full consent. The recorder crackled to life, and Elena heard a man's voice, tense but determined. I was in the general's office one afternoon when Lieutenant Sarah Chun came in for what was supposed to be a routine briefing on her engineering project. Sterling dismissed me, but I could hear raised voices through the door. When Chun left, she was visibly upset. The general called me back in and made a comment about teaching young officers about respect and hierarchy. He was adjusting his uniform and had a look on his face that I'll never forget, like he had just asserted power over someone weaker than himself. Elena felt sick to her stomach as the implications of Walsh's testimony became clear. Sterling's behavior wasn't just inappropriate, it was predatory and calculated. There's more, Chen said, stopping the recorder. Walsh has security camera footage from Sterling's office during several of these incidents. The general apparently didn't realize that his administrative assistant had access to the surveillance system. Elena stared at the two investigators in disbelief. You have video evidence? We have video evidence of several meetings between Sterling and female subordinates, Wells confirmed. The audio isn't clear, but the body language is telling. In every case, Sterling can be seen moving inappropriately close to the women, touching them without consent, and using his physical presence to intimidate them. Elena felt a mixture of vindication and horror. The evidence they were describing would devastate Sterling's reputation and career, but it also meant that the abuse had been far more extensive than she had imagined. What happens now? Elena asked. Chun gathered the documents and placed them back in the folder. Now we complete our investigation and present our findings to the appropriate authorities. Based on what we've uncovered so far, I expect that General Sterling will face court-martial proceedings on multiple charges. What about the charges against me? Wells smiled for the first time since Elena had met her. Captain, I've just come from a meeting with the commanding general of this installation. Based on the evidence we've presented, your actions are now being viewed as legitimate whistleblowing rather than insubordination. The charges against you are being dropped. Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. What kind of resistance can we expect from Sterling's supporters? Significant resistance, Chen replied honestly. Sterling has powerful allies who will try to discredit the investigation and protect him from consequences. They'll attack the credibility of the witnesses, question the motives of the investigators, and attempt to portray this as a politically motivated witch hunt. Wells nodded in agreement. Captain, you should expect your own background to be scrutinized intensively. Sterling's defense team will look for anything they can use to undermine your credibility or suggest that you had ulterior motives for challenging him. Elena had expected this, but hearing it confirmed still made her nervous. I understand. Is there anything I should be doing to prepare? Continue to be completely honest with investigators, Chen advised. Don't embellish your accounts or speculate about things you don't know firsthand. The strength of this case lies in the documented evidence and the testimony of multiple witnesses. Your role was to trigger the investigation. Now let the evidence speak for itself. As the meeting concluded, Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was relieved that the charges against her were being dropped and vindicated by the evidence that supported her allegations. But she also felt the weight of responsibility for what would happen to Sterling and to the women who were now coming forward to tell their stories. Wells walked Elena to the door of the conference room. Captain, I want you to know that what you did took extraordinary courage. Most people in your position would have looked the other way and focused on their own careers. Your willingness to speak up may have saved other women from experiencing what your cousin and so many others went through. Elena nodded her appreciation, then asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. Major, do you think we'll actually be able to get justice? Sterling has survived other challenges to his reputation. Wells considered the question carefully before answering. Captain, I've been investigating misconduct cases for most of my career, and I've learned that justice is never guaranteed. Powerful people have ways of protecting themselves, and institutional loyalty often trumps individual accountability. She paused, then continued with conviction in her voice. But this case is different. The evidence is overwhelming, the witnesses are credible, and there's too much public attention for this to be buried quietly. I think General Sterling's days of abusing his power are finally coming to an end. As Elena walked back across the base, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning in the courtyard when she had refused to salute. What had started as a single act of defiance had grown into a comprehensive investigation that could reshape how the military handled allegations of misconduct by senior officers. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Chun. Elena, I just finished my interview with the investigators. It was difficult, but I feel like a weight has been lifted from my shoulders. Thank you for giving me the courage to finally tell my story. Elena smiled as she read the message. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew that she had made the right choice. The truth was finally coming to light, and justice was within reach. But she also knew that the most difficult part of the battle was still to come. Sterling and his allies would not give up without a fight, and the final outcome would depend on whether the evidence was strong enough to overcome the institutional forces that had protected him for so many years. As the sun set over Fort Morrison, Elena prepared herself for the next phase of a struggle that had already changed her life and the lives of countless others. The truth was emerging, but the fight for justice was far from over. 6 months after Elena's refusal to salute General Sterling, the courtroom at Fort Leavenworth was packed with military personnel, media representatives, and family members of the witnesses who had come forward. The court-martial of General Marcus Sterling had become one of the most high-profile military justice cases in recent history, and the outcome would send a message about whether the military was truly committed to holding senior officers accountable for their actions. Elena sat in the witness section, wearing her dress blue uniform with the ribbons and medals she had earned during her years of service. The charges against her had not only been dropped, but her actions had been officially commended by the Inspector General's office. She had been promoted to major and assigned to a prestigious position in the Pentagon, where she would help develop new policies for preventing sexual harassment and assault in the military. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, and Elena had watched as witness after witness took the stand to tell their stories about General Sterling's misconduct. Sarah Chun had been particularly compelling, reading from her detailed diary and describing with clinical precision how Sterling had used his position to intimidate and abuse female soldiers under his command. Lieutenant Jessica Martinez had testified about the inappropriate way Sterling had looked at her during the inspection and about other incidents she had witnessed during her career. Her testimony had been supported by video evidence that Kevin Walsh had preserved, showing Sterling engaging in clearly inappropriate behavior with female subordinates. Walsh himself had been a devastating witness for the prosecution. His testimony had provided a male perspective on Sterling's behavior, and his documentation of incidents had corroborated the accounts of multiple female witnesses. The defense had tried to discredit him by suggesting he was seeking revenge for his own career disappointments, but his meticulous records and obvious remorse had made him credible in the eyes of the military jury. Now, as the court prepared for closing arguments, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The investigation had ultimately identified 17 women who had been subjected to Sterling's misconduct over the course of his career. Some had been afraid to come forward initially, but the mounting evidence and the courage of the early witnesses had convinced them to tell their stories. The prosecution's case had been methodical and thorough. They had presented evidence of a pattern of behavior spanning more than a decade, supported by documentation, witness testimony, and video evidence. They had shown that Sterling had not only abused his position to harass female soldiers, but had also systematically retaliated against those who complained or resisted his advances. The defense had fought back aggressively, as Elena had expected. Sterling's attorney had tried to portray the allegations as a coordinated attack by disgruntled former subordinates seeking to damage a distinguished officer's reputation. They had questioned the motives of the witnesses, suggested that consensual interactions had been misinterpreted, and argued that Sterling was being held to an impossible standard in an era of political correctness. But the evidence had been overwhelming, and the defense's arguments had fallen flat. Sterling's own arrogance had hurt his case. During his testimony, he had shown no remorse for his actions and had continued to display the same dismissive attitude toward women that had characterized his behavior throughout his career. The prosecutor, Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, rose to deliver her closing argument. She was a small woman with a commanding presence, and she spoke with the conviction of someone who truly believed in the importance of the case she was presenting. Members of the jury, Santos began. This case is about more than the misconduct of one officer, no matter how senior. This case is about the fundamental values that define our military: honor, integrity, service before self. General Sterling violated all of these values when he used his position to exploit and abuse the women under his command. Santos walked over to a display board that showed photos of the 17 women who had testified against Sterling. Each of these women raised her right hand and swore an oath to serve our country with distinction. They deserved leaders who would protect them, mentor them, and help them reach their full potential. Instead, they got a predator who saw their service as an opportunity to satisfy his own twisted desires. Elena watched the faces of the jury members, 5 officers, and 2 senior enlisted personnel, including 3 women. Their expressions were serious and focused, and Elena could sense their growing anger as Santos described the impact of Sterling's behavior on his victims. The defense wants you to believe that this is about political correctness run amok, Santos continued. They want you to think that distinguished officers are being unfairly targeted for behavior that was once considered normal. But there is nothing normal about a general officer using his rank to coerce sexual favors from subordinates. There is nothing acceptable about systematically destroying the careers of women who refuse to submit to harassment. Santos picked up a transcript of Sterling's testimony and read from it. When asked about his behavior toward Lieutenant Sarah Chun, the defendant said, and I quote, "Young officers need to learn that military service requires certain sacrifices. Members of the jury, sexual assault and harassment are not sacrifices that our service members should be required to make." The prosecutor moved to the evidence table and picked up Kevin Walsh's documentation. The defense has tried to discredit Mr. Walsh as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. But the evidence tells a different story. Mr. Walsh documented these incidents not for revenge, but because he knew they were wrong, and he hoped that someday someone would have the courage to act on that documentation. Santos turned to face Elena in the gallery. That courage came from Major Elena Vasquez, who refused to render honors to a man who had dishonored everything the uniform represents. Major Vasquez could have looked the other way, could have focused on her own career advancement, could have chosen the easy path of silence. Instead, she chose the difficult path of truth. The prosecutor's voice grew stronger as she approached her conclusion. Members of the jury, you have heard overwhelming evidence that General Sterling abused his position for more than a decade. You have seen video footage of his inappropriate behavior. You have heard from credible witnesses who have risked their own reputations to tell the truth. The question before you is not whether General Sterling is guilty. The evidence has already answered that question. The question is whether we, as an institution, will hold our leaders accountable for their actions. Santos returned to her seat, and Sterling's defense attorney rose for his closing argument. Elena watched as he made one final attempt to save his client's career, arguing that the charges were based on misunderstandings and exaggerations. But his words seemed hollow compared to the mountain of evidence that had been presented over the previous 3 weeks. When both sides had finished their arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. Elena joined Sarah Chun and several other witnesses in a conference room where they waited for the verdict. The atmosphere was tense, but hopeful. Everyone knew that they had presented the strongest possible case. But military juries were notoriously unpredictable. For hours later, the jury returned with their verdict. Elena, Sarah, and the other witnesses filed back into the courtroom and took their seats. General Sterling sat at the defense table, his face impassive but his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The senior member of the jury, a colonel with 30 years of service, stood to announce the verdict. General Marcus Sterling, this court finds you guilty of all charges and specifications. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and quiet sobbing. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that justice had finally been served. Beside her, Sarah Chun was crying openly, releasing years of pain and frustration. The sentencing phase took another hour. General Sterling was dismissed from service, forfeited all pay and allowances, and was sentenced to 10 years in military prison. His retirement benefits were revoked, and his military honors and decorations were stripped from him. As the court adjourned, Elena was surrounded by reporters asking for her reaction to the verdict. She spoke briefly about the importance of holding leaders accountable and praised the courage of the women who had come forward to testify. Later that evening, Elena sat with Sarah Chun in a quiet restaurant near the base, finally, able to relax after months of stress and uncertainty. I can't believe it's finally over, Sarah said, raising her glass in a toast. When I filed that first complaint 2 years ago, I never imagined it would lead to this. Elena clinked her glass against her cousin's. It's not just over. It's the beginning of something better. The policies we're developing at the Pentagon will help ensure that other women don't have to go through what you experienced. Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with hope for the first time in years. Elena, I need to thank you for what you did. I know it wasn't easy to risk your career for my sake. I didn't do it just for you, Elena replied. I did it for every woman who has ever been made to feel powerless in the face of abuse by someone in authority. I did it because staying silent would have made me complicit in the system that protected predators and punished victims. As they finished their meal, Elena reflected on the long journey from that morning in the courtyard when she had refused to salute. She thought about her parents, who had taught her to stand up for what was right regardless of the cost. She thought about the oath she had taken as an officer, and how keeping that oath had required her to challenge the very institution she had sworn to serve. The fight for justice had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. General Sterling would never again be in a position to abuse his power, and the military was already implementing new policies to prevent similar misconduct in the future. But, perhaps most importantly, Elena had helped create a culture where victims of abuse could come forward without fear of retaliation, where truth was valued more than institutional loyalty, and where even the most powerful officers were held accountable for their actions. As she walked back to her quarters that night, Elena looked up at the stars and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had kept faith with her principles, protected the vulnerable, and helped make the military a better institution for all who served. The woman who had refused to salute a general had ultimately helped bring down a system of abuse and corruption that had operated with impunity for far too long. And, in doing so, she had proven that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with courage, conviction, and an unwavering commitment to doing what is right. The following morning, Elena received orders assigning her to a new position in Washington, where she would help train military leaders on preventing harassment and creating inclusive command climates. It was important work that would help ensure that future generations of service members would serve in an environment free from the kind of abuse that Sterling had perpetuated. As she packed her belongings and prepared to leave Fort Morrison, Elena took one last look at the courtyard where she had made her fateful decision to refuse that salute. The flagpole stood tall and straight, the American flag snapping proudly in the morning breeze, a symbol of the ideals that she had fought to protect and preserve. Elena Vasquez had entered that courtyard as a captain struggling with her conscience. She was leaving as a major who had helped transform the military's approach to accountability and justice. The refusal to salute had lasted only a few seconds, but its impact would be felt for generations to come.